I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Sabaa Tahir, who is an author that has really put me through it over this past year in all of the best ways with her Ember in the Ashes series, also the National Book Award winner All My Rage, and now we have Heir, which brings us back to a world that series readers are going to be familiar with, but with a set of characters that I think they're really going to love and an all new adventure to really just lose yourself in. So thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
So I guess I'll just start with some of the questions that I think are going to be on a lot of fans' minds, which is what brought you back to this world? I mean, you wrote this incredible series, this great big arc with all of these wonderful characters and a action-filled and sometimes sadness-filled set of circumstances. And what made you say, you know what, I've got more things to do here?
I think that writing All My Rage, which was a contemporary novel, it was hopeful, but it was ultimately a very serious book. I think that that is kind of what made me turn back to fantasy. So you know how, if you're, particularly if you're a child of like the 80s, if you hear like, I don't know, Bon Jovi or Metallica, you just naturally sing along, right? That's kind of how fantasy is for me. Like it really feels like home. I loved fantasy as a kid. It was my escape. It was the genre that I turned to for comfort. I always say that when I was a kid, books were my friends and fantasy books were like my best friends. So I think there's kind of this playfulness and creativity to fantasy that I struggle to access when I'm writing contemporary books. So after writing All My Rage, I needed to access that sort of feeling again, that feeling of home in a book. So that is really what brought me to writing Heir, which is, as you said, a young adult fantasy, and it takes place in the world of an Ember in the Ashes. You don't have to read an Ember in the Ashes to enjoy Heir, but it is the same world, and it is some of the same characters. So we have a few characters who are mains in Ember who you see again in Heir.
I knew that as soon as I saw that this was coming and sort of that it was taking place in the same world, I was like, she has answered our prayers. We are back and ready. And I know that there's going to be a lot of people that feel the same way. But this book also has a lot of differences. I think the tone didn't feel the same for me in a great way, in that this feels like its own separate book and its own separate series. It's not just another book to go along with all the others. Like you said, you don't have to read them. I think either way, you get a complete experience. And I think that that's really an interesting way to approach a continuation or another piece in this big puzzle, to say like, it's going to be different and it's going to feel different.
I do think that comes from sort of this school of thought that whatever you write should to some degree be able to stand on its own, right? So I remember even working on Ember, the Ember series, and a single chapter, I had to write it so that if somebody just picked up the book and flipped it open and started reading, that chapter would make them ask questions and draw them in. They might not even know the world that they're looking at, but they would still be curious about the characters. And I think that's the approach I also had with Heir. I really wanted readers to, Ember in the Ashes is a commitment. You just went through it. As you said, it's 4 books, right? And I really wanted readers to be able to pick up Heir without having to make that commitment if they didn't want to, in the hopes that they would read Heir, they would really enjoy it. They would be mad at me for ending it the way I did. And then they'd say, you know what? I'm going to go back and read her Ember series. So it was all planned.
You really do love to put us through it. I've been like trying to describe the books to other people, and I'm like, I don't know, just never get too attached to anyone.
That's accurate. I feel like, I think that's good advice. Good book friend advice.
It's hard though, because your characters are some of my favorite characters that I've read in fantasy series. They're so well-rounded. They're so deep. They are silly and also brutal in ways that I'm like, ugh, that's everything I want in a character in this world that is also beautiful and brutal. And I wonder how you come to these voices. I mean, when you're writing, when you sit down to sort of plot this all out, Are these characters' voices one of the first things that come to you?
I think the characters sort of come introduce themselves to me and I see a general shape of them. I would liken it to looking at a sketch and you don't necessarily know eye color or features in terms of their internal landscape. But I know the general idea of who they are. So what I generally start out with is, what do they want? Why do they want it? What's standing in their way? It's a very classic sort of narrative, goal, motivation, conflict structure. But then what I try to do is really get to know them. I think of my characters as friends in a way, and in the same way you get to know a friend over the course of years, you can learn new things about them after, knowing them for many years. In that same way, I approach my characters as real full people whom I don't understand entirely. Even after writing an entire book about them, I might not understand them entirely. I felt like with the Ember series, which is 4 books, I finally deeply understood my characters as much as I was going to understand them by the time I finished book 4. And then fascinatingly, I encountered some of those characters again in Heir and realized, do I really understand them? Gosh, I think there's more to them than I thought. What a gift that is, right? It's like you get to know these characters over the course of time. And that's such a cool way into sort of understanding the human psyche. So when I think about the characters in Heir, one of the ones that stands out to me is a character named Aiz, who was very difficult to write. And getting to know her, she's very standoffish. She's a very defensive character. So getting to know her and her desires and what drove her required me actually like talking to her, which I realize sounds a little strange. But what I did is I interviewed her, and I'm saying interview in quotation marks for, folks who are listening, because obviously she's not real and I'm interviewing myself, but I was just reading a list of questions, pretending to be Aiz and answering those questions. And that really helped me get to know her better. And I do that with all my characters. So, for at least, I don't know, a few days, every time I'm writing a book, my kids and my husband will pass by my room and they'll just hear me talking in, British accents. And they'll be like, what is she doing? Oh, yeah, she's talking to her characters.
I think a lot of us readers who get very into, especially fantasy books, will know exactly what you mean when you say that, like, you treat these characters like real people, because I find myself while I'm reading having to like close the book and to like be mad at them for a little bit and be like, why did you just do that? There were several moments reading Heir where I had to take a brief break to sort of reassess how I was feeling about everyone and then go back in. And I'm talking out loud to them too.
Yeah, great. That's it. I mean, there's so many times where I'm writing and I'm like, God, she's such an idiot. But I'm like, but I'm going to have her do this anyway. Right. So books are a journey. That's the whole point, is you're going on a journey with these characters and hopefully there's some change from the beginning of book to the end. And that's what was actually really fun about Aiz, is that her change, I think, without giving anything away, it is significant.
Yeah, the journey that all of these characters go on was not quite what I expected when I started, which I love in a book, where you can think you have it figured out, especially when I'm always like, I read a lot of books. Of course I will have it figured out. No. Halfway through, I was like, oh, I really don't have it figured out. And then by the end, I was like, I just can't wait to see what happens next. And that is always that feeling I want, that I'm putting something into the book and it's giving me something back. And by the time I get to the end, I'm like, well, I can't believe I have to wait.
That is awesome. I'm really happy to hear that. And here's a shout to my editor, Ruta, who was a huge part of making the ending of that book feel really earned. That is something that I think on a first draft, a lot of writers struggle with, is, we have a vision of the end. We have a feeling of what it can be, but sometimes what we really need is someone to come in and say, well, you probably need all these elements in the first half to really make that last half work. So the revision and editing process was key to making that feeling happen.
I think it often, especially in fantasy series where, going in, okay, there's going to be multiple books, it can be hard to write that first book in a way that's like, no, we're really dropping you in. And it can be so often a lot of setup or a lot of, creating this world, which is amazing and we love it. But your books always really drop us right into that action and get us going from page 1.
I enjoy that personally. I read a book for the first time recently. It was Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings. And I've always enjoyed Brennan's books. I had read the Mistborn series, and that was actually the only series of his that I had read until, like I said recently, I read The Way of Kings. And what I really liked about it is that Brennan just drops you right in, right? He just drops you into the world and he's like, figure it out. I know you're smart. And I really like that about books. And I like it when books do that. I like it when books trust the reader. And I think in particular when as a writer for young people, I think it is important to trust them, because I think that sense of satisfaction that I remember getting as a 15 or 16 or 17-year-old when I figured out like where a book was going, it made me love reading. And I want that for young people or any person who reads this book, is that feeling of like, oh, I get it, like that light bulb moment.
I like that idea of trusting the reader, because especially I think in books for young people, it can be very easy to sort of oversimplify and say, oh, we need to bring all these themes down and we need to really lay things out. But your books have very intense themes. There is a lot of action. There is, like I said before, there is brutality and there is love. There are all these really intense and heightened things, duty, obligation, honor, that I think some people may say, oh, young adult, that's too young to really understand or to process those things. But I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think those are some of the best times to be exposed to those ideas and to really let young people work it out for themselves and to make their own choices about that.
I completely agree. I think some of the themes in this book are meant to make the reader think. So everything from sort of the nuance and the complexity of the human existence, and like specifically something that we realize, I think, first in our teenage years, which is that the people who you love individually can be good people, but at the same time, they can be doing terrible things to others, right? Things that we don't know or we don't see as young people. And I do believe that that's kind of the curse of the human condition. And I think that until we find a way to kind of bring that to light and create a conversation around the bad things that happen, that sort of really terrible dichotomy will continue to exist and will continue to affect young people wherever they are in the world, right? So I do think it's particularly important for us to face that in fiction and to look at it and to not shy away from the complexity of it. And that goes for a lot of the themes in Heir, really. I mean, I definitely don't. I was a journalist. I was a copy editor many years ago now. But those years stuck with me, and the stories I read stuck with me, because I think what haunts me to some degree is this idea that the same stories that I was reading as a copy editor in 2003 and 2004 are exactly what's happening now. We have not learned anything, and perhaps we will not learn anything, but I still try to put those themes and these occurrences and these tragedies into my work in the hopes that maybe we will start learning if we keep looking at it, if we keep bringing these things to light.
And that's something that I think fantasy especially can do in a way that no other genre can. We can analyze these sort of larger concepts and larger themes in a different way. I mean, in Heir specifically, there is so much of that dichotomy between love and sort of what comes when you realize the people you love aren't who you hoped. There's also so much of these systemic oppressions and systemic abuses of political systems, of religious systems, that we can look at a little bit more pulled back, since they are a world that isn't our own. And I think it allows us a different view into those things.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many, one of the things that I talk about in this book is the sort of like the hegemony instituted by a country or a nation with superior weaponry, right? There is an attack in this world where an entire, seemingly very strong country is destroyed very quickly with, no regards to sort of rules of war or combat or really like any understanding them. And that has happened so often in history. And in the modern day, particularly with the United States, with, our own country has done this. And so it is something that I think is important for us to look at and for young people to look at, because there are real lives and real people who are affected by these things, and entire nations that are affected by these things, and peoples that are affected by these things. And yet we don't always connect to them. We might know they're happening. We might watch the news. We might say, this is really sad, or this makes me, feel depressed or whatever. But I don't know if that's the same as really feeling, a deep empathy, right? It's like it's something more internal, something where like you're struggling to kind of make sense of it because it is so awful. And I'm trying to actually bring that. I struggle with that. I struggle to make sense of the world. Whoever is perpetrating the violence, I do struggle to make sense of that. And I think part of that struggle, for me, I want to bring to the page. I want people to feel that haunting. I want them to feel that sense of unease, that why is the world like this? Why do we treat each other this way? I do think you can do that in young people's fiction. I think it's the best place to do it. Really, that's when I started asking those questions.
And there is this sense of desensitization almost that comes with the sort of the onslaught of the news and the access we have now to just continuous violence. And
yeah.
I mean, if you think, even if you're going on TikTok, on Instagram, on anything, I mean, it can be so nonstop. But I think one of the best ways to learn like empathy, like you said, is through fiction. Some of the best experiences I've had of opening and expanding my mind have been through novels and through understanding someone's experience that's not my own. And it's definitely happened in science fiction and fantasy as well, not just, contemporary or historical. Sometimes we need that space and that difference to really fully come to terms with something.
I agree. And also sometimes fantasy, I think, allows us to look at humanity closer and, like you said, in kind of in a more safe way. And not just the dark parts of humanity, right? A lot of Heir is banter, and it's friendship, and it's found family, and it's romance, and it's humor, and it's, the world is ending, but I really have a crush on this girl, right? Which is just, again, it really is trying to put like our humanity first. And that was actually one of the joys of writing this book. Is absolutely I wanted to bring out some of the more difficult themes that are going on and that have happened in our world, but I also wanted to have the fun of, a will they won't they kind of romance. And, like I said, this sense of found family for these characters who have gone through so much and are trying to really just make it in the world. And sometimes the only way they can do that is through very dark humor, or through saying, you know what, this relationship is a terrible idea, but I'm going for it because why not? Right. And we as humans also make those decisions. And, that's what makes life interesting. So again, why not put it in the book?
And for that, Saoirse is my girl. She is, her humor and her relationships to the characters around her and watching her sort of navigate being an outsider, becoming an insider in certain groups was really so much fun. I found myself really looking forward to her sections because I just think she is a great character and really highlights that balance between, things are bad and there are struggles and there are traumas and there are things to overcome. And yet I'm here to make the most of it.
Exactly. I love Saoirse's wit. I love her humor. I love that she doesn't like to take things seriously. And that's in a weird way, kind of her way of taking things seriously, right? Like, she very rarely will get pushed down to where she's not laughing at something. And I love that about her because, laughter is the way that I have dealt with a lot of my own issues through life since I was young, right? It's sort of funny. In my first series, there isn't a ton of humor. It's there here and there in little spots, but it's not, I didn't really, lean into it. And with Heir, with Saoirse specifically, I finally found like, oh, this is a character who depends on her sort of dark humor to get through things, I mean, even at the very beginning, this is a teeny tiny spoiler, but, she kind of thinks that she's going to die. She's like, oh, it's over, right? And her reaction to this is not like, oh my gosh, I'm so sad. It's like, oh, what a horrible way to go. How embarrassing, right? And that is quintessentially Saoirse and like what makes her character special, right? Is that is her way of approaching the world. So she was just a joy to write. Saoirse was really fun to write.
And that goes into, I think, the tonal difference between the first books in the series, I guess, and now this new series, that this has so much of a more expansive feeling to me in a lot of ways. It really felt like you were having fun while you were writing it.
I was absolutely having fun while I was writing it. I was giggling. I was smiling. When I got, one of the things that, we love about genre fiction are the tropes, right? And there's so many. There's, some of the obvious ones like enemies to lovers, which is actually not in this book. But there's other things like just one bed or, fake engagement or fake marriage. And, you will see some of those tropes in this book because I love those tropes. Whenever I'm reading a book and I see one of those come up, I'm like, yes, and I get so happy. So I wanted to, again, kind of give that joy to readers, but I also wanted to experience it for myself. It is fun to write those tropes and kind of turn them on their head and make them into something else. So, one that I've been talking about for Heir is this concept of fake engagement. Not going to give away who it is, but I am going to say it was a delight to write. And when you guys get to that chapter, you will know I was grinning the whole time as I was writing it.
There are so many good moments. I mean, there is romance in the Ember series, but it's like a lot of yearning and painful moments. And I was like, I can do that again. But then I was so pleasantly surprised to be like, oh, there's some fun stuff in here. And there's some different things that I'm like, I think readers are really going to have a good time to balance out those like heavier moments. Because I don't want to spoil anything, but you still hit us with some big sads, but yes, in a way that makes it all much more worth it.
I do love those extremes. I actually blame the desert. That's where I grew up. And I think that growing up in a place of extremes sort of makes one gravitate toward those things. Not in life. I'm not going to jump out of a plane or anything. But in my fiction, I do love the extremes of a really, juicy romance, but with very, very high stakes at the same time. I think that's what makes books really fun. Absolutely. I love cozy books. I love books with like a lower stakes that are just, it's like eating a cupcake reading them. That's not what I write though. So, this is definitely more high stakes. I want you to be a little stressed out. I want you to, when you get those moments of romance or spice, and that's what I want you to enjoy those moments because you can bet it's probably not going to last.
There were moments where I had like audible and physical reactions to some of the things, but that's fine. That's what I want in a book. I need a book to smack me in the face sometimes. And I think that happens so often when you're able to write about these characters at points of transition in their lives. So many of these characters, I would say, frankly, all of them are at huge decision points. There are things that are either they are being forced to choose or they are choosing between these huge differences, these paths that they can go down. And that's some of the most fun things to get to read is like, maybe they are not making the choices I would make, but they're making their choices.
Exactly. I love transition points in book. And I think, again, within young adulthood, starting, from age 13, 14, all the way up through your mid-20s to late 20s, you are making so many decisions that feel life-altering. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. You don't know yet, but they feel life-altering. It feels like you have to make the right one. Something that has always stuck with me is a Guardian interview done with an author named Jason Reynolds, incredible writer. And he had spoken to a young person in a juvenile detention center. And that young man had said, when I made the decisions I made, I didn't think they were the wrong ones at the time. They seemed like the right ones at the time. And that too is part of all of these stories and everything I write. We are looking at this decision from the outside saying, well, clearly that's, idiotic. However, the young person who is in the situation at the time feels like that's their only choice, that they have to do that. And I wanted to write a book in which that is happening. That is absolutely what is occurring. However, it also means that they have to face the consequences of those things and sometimes figure out their way out of those consequences to a better life. And it does sort of come back to the idea that even when you make the tough decisions, even when you do the things you don't want to do, you still can find a way through those things. you can mourn, you can go through traumatizing things, you can go through difficult things, and there is an other side to that. You can make your way out of those things. And so that is also important to me as a writer. I do love those transition points because I want to show, like, hey, how do you survive this? It's almost like, to me, fiction was a guide in many ways, right? And even still, as I'm writing these books, I'm working things out for myself. I'm asking myself, well, how do people get through this? Well, write it, figure it out.
And that's why we turn so often to literature and to fiction, I think, to sort of process through those things. I mean, I have never been in, and hope I will never be in, most of the situations in this book. And yet I did find myself stopping and thinking, well, what would I do? And especially to be able to look back and think of myself at 20, at 18, at 16, what would I have done? Especially in the sense that there are so many choices that you make at those times where you don't even realize the scope of the choice that you're having to make. You don't even realize, you think it's just like, okay, I'll do this. And not knowing that, 5-10 years down the line, you're still thinking about those choices that we make when we're that age.
At the age of 18, a young person's frontal lobe is not developed, right? Like, their decision-making abilities are not completely developed. And this does not, of course, mean that they shouldn't be held responsible for choices they make. But it does mean that we have to think about a society that looks at these choices and decides that that is who that young person is for the rest of their life, that they will never be anybody but the person who made that choice. And I disagree with the premise of that. I disagree with the idea that we are who we are at the age of 14 or 16 or 18 based on one decision that we made at that time that might be consequential. Change does happen. And it doesn't just happen when we're young people, it happens when we're older as well. I was recently talking to a friend about fashion and about how it was something that I had never really felt like I could approach or understand, and how I'd become more fascinated with it recently, and how delightful it is to be a 40-something-year-old and still find something completely new in the world to get excited about. In the same way, like, I'm still learning, I'm still making mistakes and still learning. If I, again, as a 40-something, am allowed to make mistakes and learn, why would we not let our young people do the same thing? Again, doesn't mean they don't face consequences for their actions, but maybe we could approach it with a little less like, this is who you are forever. And again, that is what the book is about a lot, because I don't love books where the villain is just the villain and they're just bad and that is it. Like, those people absolutely exist in the world, and that's the way the world is. But at the same time, I do like to look at how we get there.
I will say, in the Ember series, one of my favorite characters to read, I struggle to say maybe that she was my favorite character, but maybe one of my favorite characters to read was Karis Vittoria, because watching that unfold, watching her story unfold and her choices was so fascinating to me the whole time, even though ostensibly that is one of the villains and that is one of the people that we know we shouldn't like. And there's not a lot of like redeeming qualities there, but yet I was so fascinated by the choices she made.
And, Karis Vittoria owns her choices, right? She leans into them fully and she's like, yes, this is what I'm doing. And she does not look back. And there's really only one or two decisions she's made in her life that she deeply regrets. And those haunt her, right? Those are the decisions that haunt her. And I think that's why she leans into most things, because she, instead of sort of becoming indecisive, she becomes ultra decisive. But even still, at the end, I've had readers say, I cannot believe you made me feel sorry for her. Like, I cannot believe that you actually did that. Like, I'm really mad at you. I just wanted to hate her in peace. Why couldn't you just let me hate her in peace? And it's like, because that's just not how the world is, right? So why, I didn't want to put that in a book.
It is that reflection of how we are as humans and the things that we value, and returning to those things, and also accepting that sometimes we have to accept that we were wrong, or we have to accept that we've changed, and that we have to also accept that other people change. And even when we really are like, no, I can't let my view of this person be different than what I thought, it's like, no, that's nothing is static and everything is moving.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And again, literature is one of the ways that we are able to safely explore those things. It makes us think, right? how many times have I read a book and looked at a character and kind of felt like, ugh, like that character is so weak, or gosh, why didn't she just say A, B, or C? And then thought about my own life and sort of been uncomfortable because I'm like, oh God, I think I did that same thing. It's like you hold up a mirror when you went with certain books, and you have to look at yourself. And I think with Heir, to some degree, I know I don't like to ever tell readers what to take from a book. I'm like, take what you want. If what you want to take is the romance, that's great. I love it. If what you want to take is, the deeper themes, cool. That's cool too. But I will say that I like my books to at least be somewhat of a mirror where we look at ourselves and we'd say, what would I do in that case? Or what have I done in a situation that maybe isn't identical, but is similar? And what kind of person does that make me?
And storytelling is so important in the worlds of your books as well. How we tell our stories, who tells them, how they're recorded even is sort of this piece that comes up again and again, I find in your work. This, like, a lot of your characters are storytellers. And I think that is really fun to read as well.
It is a position of great responsibility, right? To be a storyteller. And again, I think it comes from working in the media for a while and realizing that who told the stories really, really mattered. Because who tells the story then, will really dictate, well, how are you telling it? And what do you see? And how do you view the world? And it's also why I like to tell books from multiple points of view, because I really like a story to be kind of internal, external, but also we're looking at it from different angles. The same event can be viewed in different ways. And Heir is an example of really one event that is viewed very, 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 very differently by multiple characters. And the questions that brings up of like, okay, in this case, like, who is doing the attacking? Who is the attacked? Has the attacked always been the victim, or have they sometimes been the aggressor too? And those questions are really what made the book fun to write and made the book, something that I never got bored of. Like, I worked on this book starting in 2020. And it was fun the whole time. And I can't always say that, All My Rage was a contemporary book I wrote before this one. And that was a 15-year journey. And that was very difficult at times. It's not to say that Heir wasn't difficult. It was, but it was a lot of fun in the process, and it was because of questions like these.
I have to ask, since you mentioned writing from these different perspectives, is there one voice among all the books? Is there one character's voice that you've loved being in more than the others? Like, if you had to pick.
I loved writing from the perspective of the Nightbringer in the Ember series. The Nightbringer is, for those who haven't read, is the primary villain of the Ember series. And I had great, great, great empathy for the Nightbringer. And I really loved writing from his perspective. I will say that is probably my absolute most favorite perspective to write from was his. He was just such an interesting, you're around for 1,000 years, longer really, but, you're around for thousands of years. You must have learned some interesting stuff. So
those were very fun to read as well. I always love those perspectives that maybe we don't get as much of, but when we do, they like pack a punch and they're there for a reason.
Yeah, I enjoyed those. And in Heir, I enjoyed writing the perspective of a character named Sarah. Sarah is a character who seems very peripheral to the story, but as we go into book 2, I think readers are going to find that he's more important than they might have realized. So
going through, I also have to say the audiobook for Heir, if anybody out there is an audiobook fan, the audiobook is really incredible.
It's phenomenal. Yeah, the narrators did a wonderful job. PRH Audio did a great job. It's great.
I have to always ask, because we've talked so much about how books make us think and how they make us feel. What are some of your literary influences and some of the things that make you a reader and a writer?
So I think my influence really, like in fantasy, it really started with like some of sort of the like Tolkien. I'm reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings when I was very young, and like the Nazgul, like the monsters in Lord of the Rings, like that ended up having like a big impact on like sort of the way I imagine monsters in my world. And then also my own family. My mom was, loved to tell stories and would tell me stories about jinn when I was a little girl. And, anytime I visited Pakistan, my cousins, we would tell jinn stories to each other, and mostly they would be the ones telling them. And, that stuff sticks. So really it was sort of both those things. And then also when I was young, Ursula Le Guin, I loved Ursula Le Guin's books. I loved Terry Brooks. His Shannara series was one of my like formative book series. Also, I think the book that made me think, oh, I could actually become a writer, like writers are real people, was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And it's sort of a joke that like for so many South Asian writers of a certain age, like that was the book where we were like, wait, what? We can be writers? But, you know, I definitely fall into that cliche.
I love those sort of hearing the different types of things that come together to make writers what they are, because I think especially when we're looking at authors like you who write both contemporary but write fantasy as well, it is really a combination of all the things that we've read and encountered that sort of lead us to where we are.
Absolutely. Agreed. Yeah.
I have to ask too, because I wonder if you were to talk to a reader who has never picked up one of your books before, and Heir is going to be the first one, what is the kind of reader that you hope finds this book on a table or a bookshelf somewhere?
I hope it is the reader who is going to stay up late, you know, who is like, I am prepared to like be up until 3 a.m. I hope is the reader who loves banter, who loves, you know, like found family and sort of these high stakes and like high concept. Like that's the reader that I would love. But really anybody who's willing to pick up my book, read the first chapter and give it a shot. Yes. Thank you. You're the best. I mean, I will not be picky with my readers. I do not mind any reader. I have had a grandmother in her 80s write to me and say, I read your books with my granddaughter. It was such a bonding experience. I had another reader write to me and say, I drove across the country and my dad and I listened to your books together and it like totally brought us closer together. I've had readers from many different countries say, you know, oh, you know, I loved your books. I thought the translation was wonderful. So thank you to my translators who do such incredible work. So truly, like, I am not picky with my readers. You know, if cats could read, I'd be like, yes, cats, read my book. I'd probably be like, no, there's not enough cats in these books, but
that's true. There is a lack of cats, but
there's a lack of cats.
You have time to make that up. There is always more to put in, and I think that
that's right.
There are so many readers that will come to this, both readers of fantasy and maybe people who are trying fantasy for the first time. I think the way that you are able to build these incredibly complex worlds with languages and religions and customs and values that feel so unique but yet so familiar, I think there will be a lot of people who find something there.
I hope so, but thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
And no matter what, I think that if you pick up Heir, or whether you've read your other series or not, there's something so wonderful about the characters you've created. And if they haven't picked it up, I'm sure they will. So thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Heir. It was really wonderful to have you.
Thank you very much, Jenna. It was a pleasure.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Heir. I'm Mark. I'm at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy Donald in Detroit. Hello, Donald.
Hey, how are you guys?
Well, I'm always wonderful because we're talking about books. But I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So, first of all, it's always exciting to get a new release from Tahir. Her Ember and the Ashes series really continues to sell like crazy. It is always very, very popular. It's always a hit and really just continues to inspire and entertain readers. So anything new coming out from her is always a win. But this episode is giving me a chance to talk about a new release by another author who I truly, truly love, and that is the fantasy writer Nevo. If you are a poured over regular, you have heard me rave about Nevo, and guess what? The raves will never cease. I think she is absolutely brilliant. And she's got a brand new book out, and it is The City in Glass. This is a little bit longer than a novella, not quite a novel. She does great smaller pieces that I think are just really stunning. But this new one is a gorgeous, gorgeous fable about love and eternity and grief. And I want everybody to get their hands on it. Quick elevator premise. We follow a demon who has essentially adopted this small seed of a city and has nurtured it into greatness until the forces of heaven stroll in and burn it to the ground. Our demon, mother, goddess, whatever you want to call her, this beautiful being of chaos and love, is now mourning amongst the ruins of something that she feels so proud of and passionate about, and something that she's helped build and create, and is vowing to bring it back to its glory. Her only real light in this horrible situation is that she's at least trapped one of these destructive angels to live out his eternity in the rubble along with her, which is not great, but at least she's done something to kind of jab back. That's pretty much all I'm going to say. The rest kind of flows in this beautiful way because their complex relationship really starts to bloom and evolve into something very unusual for the both of them, we'll say. But just know that in Nevo's delicate hands, the layers just build so beautifully. I love the way that she kind of plays with time and memory in all of her novels, and this one in particular really works well because these two main characters are immortal and eternal and have been through a lot, and to kind of pull them back into something a little bit more intimate is really lovely. So this book just sings like a eulogy. It is sad, it is grief-stricken, it is gorgeous, and the emotional journey that the immortals take will just make you rethink what fantasy can do. So please check out The City in Glass by Nevo. Donald, what do you have for us?
Thanks, Mark. That sounds amazing. I'm definitely going to take a look at that title. What I have for us this time around is a classic. Way back in 1977, a little book called The Sword of Shannara was published. This would turn into a 30-plus book series with multiple tie-in series and all kinds of craziness. But this was the book that started it all. And why I picked this one to go along with Heir was it does have to do with an heir to a lost bloodline, but it's also just kind of goes back to the origins of the fantasy genre, right? This is old school sword and sorcery, monsters, wizards, magic, castles. It's inspired obviously by Tolkien, mythology, but it's its own thing. As you read this book specifically, and then if you decide to read on through the rest of the series, you are pulled into a vastly unique world that's oddly very similar to ours. And that's going to make you not only want to keep reading to find out why do you feel that way, but you're also just led down that old school, there's always something around the corner, there's always an adventure happening, there's always a side quest, there's always a new person you have to meet. And the main character is Shea Omsford, and they are a half-elven character, which I think is very important to like the kind of books we want to read nowadays. It really shows just how much the fantasy genre is very, inclusive and empowering to all different sorts of readers out there. And she's up against, the Warlock Lord. Very typical old school fantasy villain name. But the Sword of Shannara is the core of the story, and it's very much a little like, the Sword and the Stone. But at the heart of it is this one character and their journey in finding not only their place in this world, how they fit into this legacy and bloodline and what they're really the heir of, and opens it up to the next 29 books in the series. So my book, again, is from 1977. It's Terry Brooks. I didn't mention his name before. Sword of Shannara. If you haven't heard about this book, this is, as I quote Ann Patchett all the time, it's new to you, right? But it's a book you're going to love, and you're going to then have to go and buy all of them. I'm sorry, you're just going to do it. But that's the book I have picked for this time around. Mark?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And finally, they have repackaged the series, or at least the first chunk, in new trade paperback format with beautiful covers. Yes. Also, the Ember and the Ashes series just got a revamp with beautiful new covers. So it just all works together as it should in our book world. Oh, and Heir, it's so pretty. Yes, readers are going to love this. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning into Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also check us out on YouTube if you want to have a visual of all of this going on. And you can check out our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
I am at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.